how did they pick their targets? And unanimously, they all agreed that within 2 hours of conversation with a girl, they would know whether she was worth pursuing or not. They would know whether she was the kind of person who would put his needs before her own, whether she would have sympathy for him if he said that he had been harmed or had a poor childhood or whatever. And they would be alert to all those signals within a couple of hours of conversation. As a matter of fact, two or three of them would say within half an hour we would know them.
If you want to really get in the mind of a predator, you want to talk to Don Hennessy. Don has been working in the area of male intimate abuse for more than 30 years. He was the clinical director of the National Domestic Violence Intervention Project in Ireland for 15 years, and he's published 3 books that analyze the actions of the male abuser, who he names a psychophile, and explains how a targeted woman can recover her own instincts. You can't afford to not hear this episode. Let's get started with the Restoring Resilience podcast. Dawn, thank you so much for joining me on the Restoring Resilience podcast. I'm very excited to have you today.
Lovely to be on with you.
All right. Well, I know you have 3 books, and I had the pleasure of reading Steps to Freedom, Escaping Intimate Control, which I have to tell you, I thought was one of the best breakdowns of male intimate abusers and how they gain control of you and how they can break free. And as I was reading it, I was actually really interested because it kind of follows the similar pattern that I have written in my book, like how we have to have awareness about what's going on, understand the impact it's had, and then we can go on to experience that post-traumatic growth and agency and all of that. So much I could talk to you about, but today we're going to be diving into the mind of the abuser and how you can escape their control once and for all. So before we get into the book, just tell everybody a little bit about you, what you do, how you got into, studying male intimate abusers.
Okay, so for about the first 45, 48 years of my life, I worked in a different career. But I had initially set out to become a missionary priest and was being trained for the priesthood. I think I was a bit too cynical, so they asked me to leave. And also, I had been abused a number of times by clerics when I was younger. So when I got the opportunity when I was sort of in my late 40s to change career, I decided this is what I really wanted to do. I wanted to be helpful to people. I wanted to make a small contribution to the world. And as a matter of fact, when I started first in counseling, I thought I was going to change the whole world. Found out I didn't manage to do that in the
Don't we
meantime.
all? That's what we think.
I was doing what we call couples counseling here in Ireland. I was still working under the auspices of the Catholic Church. And we had a centre in Cork City, which is a small city on the south of Ireland. And while working there, my direct boss, who was a clinical psychologist trained in Chicago, actually, he said there was a lot of abuse and violence going on in families, in homes, and maybe we should do something about it. So we set about studying whatever we might do about it for 2 years. We didn't actually do any work in the area, just explored what was going on. And I got quite taken by what we were beginning to find out. And being in the Catholic Church at the time in Ireland, there were a number of paedophile priests who were also engaged with us in services so that the diocese wouldn't be exposed too much. I think that was the aim of the work. So we needed to handle that in a way which protected the diocese initially, which I found really disturbing, but I didn't say it to anybody at the time. And then we ran some groups for abusive men in relationships while also running groups for their partners. And I think we were the only people in the Western culture who were doing that kind of work together. We found other groups where there was one team dealing with men and another team dealing with women, but we actually worked with both sides of the coin. And we went about it very diligently and tried to analyze what was going on. And our initial ambition was that we would explain to these men, because we're very good teachers ourselves, that we would explain to them that what they were doing was harmful and that they could get whatever they wanted out of life without harming their spouses or their children. So that was our initial position. After 3 or 4 years, we realized two things. First of all, that we could not have the abusers as our clients at any level, even though we were unsure about it at the beginning. So the victim, or the target woman, as I call her, she became our client in very clear ways. And we went back and we interviewed, I would imagine, about 100 of these women who had been partners of the men in the programs. And we discovered that what we were doing was actually dangerous and was leading to more abuse, maybe in more subtle ways, but the women's lives were not improving at any level. So that set us back really, and we changed the format of the group very slightly. Instead of we educating the men, we encouraged the men to educate us. So we would listen to them a lot and we would record them a lot. And even on occasions, we would give them free rein to run the group for a half hour or whatever. And what began to emerge was quite startling for us, really. And what we learned from these abusers were that they were clearly never out of control, even though they were angry or seemed to be raging at times, or they explained away their behaviors by saying that they lost it or they couldn't manage their temper. But actually, they admitted to us that they were always in control and their behavior was what they wanted to do at the time. And that kind of almost scared us. We said, we're getting out of our depth here. But we stuck at it. And bit by bit, we began to realize that what we were dealing with was much more malicious than what we had ever imagined.
Wow. I'm taking notes like so much of what you said. The fact that, I mean, you as a group of therapists started out thinking you could change these men. I mean, and that's what we do in the real world. You know, it's a partner, it's our family member, and we think, well, I just need to love them more. I just need to be more patient. I just need to give them more time. They're just emotionally immature. And to your point, these abusers will actually exploit that idea. They'll let you think that they're out of
Indeed,
control and they have anger issues and they're emotionally dysregulated. And the whole time, what you found out is that they're always in control.
that's scary, yeah, but that's what we found out, yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you know male intimate abusers very well. And I wanted to say too, like in your book, you said these tactics apply to females as well. So female abusers, you know, we can kind of anybody who's listening, because I have audience who's male and females. And I've known some female psychopaths as well. And as I was reading your book, Steps to Freedom, I was thinking this really fits. I mean, whether we
Mm,
look at it on the female side or the male side. But we're going to focus today specifically on male intimate abusers because I know that's what you're really familiar with. And I want to actually read how you describe intimate abusers in the book because I thought it was so great. So you say the relationship dynamic with an intimate abuser is dangerous, and many clients experience a sense of malevolence or evil from this person. The goal of invading your mind to have easy access to your thoughts has led me to discuss the abuser in terms of psychophilia or psychophile. So, talk to me about why you felt the need to actually create this term.
Well, I think for clarity for myself more than anything else, I was initially told by the first two people that I brought the term to, said that won't catch on at all, Don. Nobody will buy that, you know.
I think
So
it fits perfectly.
I said, I need to write it for myself. I need to have a word when I go back to refer to it that it fits. And what I also discovered bit by bit, it took me a while. Like most men, I'm a slow learner, you know. So it took me a while to realize that up to maybe 50 or 60 years ago, post war, in Ireland certainly, um, women were controlled by physical violence. That was the method used constantly. I was even told about it by my mother back in the 50s as to how it went on. And then I think the laws began to change in Ireland, as I imagined it in America, and physical violence was being addressed in a way that it was no longer tolerable within intimate relationships. So the men had to find another way of gaining the control over their partners. And this method of mind control was developed by men. Now, I'm sure they could have done it at any age because men are pretty good at getting what they want, but they had to go away from the physical violence and develop some kind of mental control. So when I started in the work initially back in I suppose 1990, 1991, I promised myself I would visit refuges here in Ireland where women were living and where they had fled from their homes and that. And I went down to interview 6 different refuges, the clients in them, and I asked the question, same question everywhere: why are you in here? And I expected to hear a long list of broken bones and black eyes and teeth knocked out and all of that. And almost entirely the women's answer to me was, I need to get away from the mental torture that I'm experiencing. And
Wow.
that stunned me. I mean, I didn't expect that. I didn't even think of it at the time. That set me back to go back and try and think, what was that like? Where did it come from? And how did it work so well? And at the same time, I was analyzing pedophilia. And as I say, we had some clients from the church who were working in our center. And there was a place for treating these people as a residential treatment in the UK, and we went over there for a few days and we went back again second time. And when we were flying back the second time, I said to my colleague who was sitting next to me in the plane, I said, you know, the language that they're using for pedophiles actually fits exactly the same as the guys that we're dealing with back in Cork and the psychophiles that we're experiencing. So that's where the language came from. That's where I got this idea of breaking it down into certain tactics and words that would describe actions that were hard to define or hard to identify. And the other thing I recognized from speaking to women back in the 90s was that they had no idea that this was happening around them. They were completely unaware of how these guys are operating. And I found that if I could explain that to people and people would eventually become aware of it, that maybe then something could be done to deal with it. And that's been my ambition ever since, really.
And I think you did a great job of that in your book. You know, the when I was able to read Steps to Freedom, does a great job of picking up on the subtleties because it's the things that are hard to explain that I think are so damaging.
Yes.
And your research is mirroring that of physical abuse. I mean, that's awful as well, but it's a different experience, I think, because other people see that. There's no question about if it's happening, how it's happening. So you're going to get support, you're going to get resources. There's not going to be a question of, well, you shouldn't have said that, and then they wouldn't have slapped you across the face. Obviously not. But when you're talking about gaslighting, coercive control, manipulation, intimidation, threats, betrayals, you can't hold that in your hand. You can't say, see, I'm being abused. So you have the double whammy of you're being abused and nobody believes you and nobody gets
Yeah.
it.
Or even worse than that, what I began to explore was the fact that my clients, the women that I worked with, actually they didn't know what actually happened to them. They were unaware of it at the beginning. They didn't understand how they were groomed or how they were set up, how the conditions of the relationship were outlined. They didn't get a written letter with these are the conditions, but bit by bit they realized what the conditions were and what the sanctions were if they didn't follow the conditions. And they couldn't figure out how they learned all of that, how they got informed by all of that, but they had been informed and they were living according to that information. This fascinated me that guys could be so subtle and so cruel in a way that they could do that to somebody else without the other person knowing it.
And I think one of the reasons that we struggle to know that is because these abusers target certain people. They look for people with certain traits. You say kindness, loyalty, dedication, truthfulness. Abusers are looking for that in people, and then they assess quite quickly whether or not you have those traits. So, talk to us about how abusers do that. How do they assess you?
Well, it was fascinating because we recorded a couple of groups where we asked that question. How did they pick their targets? And unanimously, they all agreed that within 2 hours of conversation with a girl, they would know whether she was worth pursuing or not. They would know whether she was the kind of person who would put his needs before her own, whether she would have sympathy for him if he said that he had been harmed or had a poor childhood or whatever. And they would be alert to all those signals within a couple of hours of conversation. As a matter of fact, two or three of them would say within half an hour we would know them. And a woman who was very prominent in Irish female world, she was one of the leaders of the women's movement in Ireland for years. When I said that out in public first, she said, Don, she said, that explains it. I was at a ball one time, she said, and it was to do with high-powered government uh, outing, and there were very capable people in the room, and we were all dancing and singing and having a good time. And two or three of the girls got up to go to the bathroom, and they all left their handbags with me. And I ended up in an abusive relationship with one of the guys who was there. And about 6 months afterwards, he told me that he knew I was good and I was kind because I took care of the other girls' bags the day they were at the dance and going to the bathroom. Like, she couldn't believe that that's how clearly she had signaled her attitude to other people, and he had spotted it. She had never spoke to him at that stage, but he'd seen it, and he targeted her after that. So these guys are not alone, are they, everywhere, but they're constantly on the lookout for targets.
Incredible. And that makes so much sense. I know for many other people, and for my story too, my abuser would repeatedly talk about how I'm a therapist. He said he even prayed for a therapist. And that didn't sit right in my gut. I'm like, I don't want to be a partner's therapist. Like I don't want to do that. But there was an implication there. I think that's what you're highlighting is he saw me and he saw what I could do and would do for him and started framing it like, well, you're not going to treat me like my exes. And I'm so glad you don't do this. And I'm so glad you understand this. They're corralling you to make you conditioned to do certain things from the very beginning, before you even know what you're doing or before you know what's happening. And so they've targeted you, then there's the setting up phase. So then, like, they're setting you up to do multiple things, take all the responsibility for the relationship. I wanted to highlight too in your book how you talk about this. So, how an abuser does this is they give the woman responsibility for the emotional temperature of the relationship. She's forced to take the blame, even when she's not responsible for a problem. He redefines her truth and makes it his truth. He retells the story of their relationship in ways that enhance his position. He demeans her talents and exaggerates her faults. He demonstrates the type and intensity of sanctions. So if you do something wrong, here's what's going to happen. And once these conditions in the relationship are established, he's going to monitor and make sure they're adhered to. And eventually, this just becomes embedded in the woman's thoughts and overwhelms her own worldview. You
Sure.
just laid out what is so damaging about these relationships and yet so hard to put into words. And what are the ways that abusers create these conditions?
Well, you mentioned the primary one, which is the transferring of blame. Once that's achieved, the woman will be analyzing her own behavior rather than examining his behavior. So she actually misses a lot of the game that he's playing, and she spends her time trying to find ways of being better or changing so that he will be happier in the relationship. And that's a constant with her once it's established. She never loses the belief that if I could only understand him, which is what a therapist would be able to do, or if I could only have more empathy for him, or if I could only sympathize with him because he had a tough childhood, or whatever else, that all my anxieties and all my difficulties will begin to lessen and I'll be slightly happier the more I can do that. So she puts pressure on herself to actually change, to be able to understand him and to be able to empathize with him. And the other thing he does is he monitors his progress. So a non-skilled abuser will jump in and demand all sorts of advanced relationship things from the beginning almost. Whereas these guys, they will know how well they're getting on. They will be able to measure their progress by how much resistance they're experiencing in the bedroom. If they experience less resistance in the bedroom, they will up the pressure on the woman during all the day. There's no relenting in it. They're on the phone or they're leaving messages, or worse than that, she is engaging in what I call a monologue in her head about him. So even though when he's not there, she's talking to him and trying to figure him out. I see you smiling. Did that happen before, you know?
Yes, absolutely. I call it the omnipresence, where they're not even around. They become this omnipresent voice. And part of our healing is learning that that voice that's in your head is not really yours. It's been implanted, but you didn't know it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's how she begins to get drawn in. And the creation of what one of my clients calls compost in her head when she can't see the truth anymore, that it's a kind of a confusion and an anxiety is all that's in her brain and nothing is ever clear anymore. And her the really sad thing I find um, is that her own intuition is silenced. So she doesn't listen to her intuition anymore
Right.
because every time she brought it up initially, she was told she was wrong, that it's stupid, that she doesn't know what she's talking about, that her intuition is badly informed. Whereas I try to remind my clients that it's the only integral part of you. It's the one part that hasn't been invaded by him or by anybody else or by the world itself, even and the attitudes of the world. So it's kind of pristine in that way. It doesn't take aboard other people's views at all. It just reacts to what's good for the woman. And
Right.
I try to connect my clients with their intuitions in very small ways. There's a woman over in Denmark, and she got on to me about 2 months ago. I speak to her every week on the phone, and she was saying, "What am I going to do?" And I had no idea who she was. I just knew that she put the guy out. She barred him from her home, and she has 3 children in their 20s and 30s. But I said to her, "I'd like you to do one little thing for me." I said, "I'd like you to go into town on Saturday." And she said, "Don, I haven't been in town for 24 years on my own."
Wow.
And she said, "I'm frightened." And I said, "I'd like you to do it and see how it feels like." And just that one small exercise changed her whole thinking. She just realized that what she'd put up with for the last 24 years was still present, even though she got rid of him. It was still in her head. And by just doing something that she was not allowed to do for 24 years, it doesn't sound very risky, it doesn't sound very major even, but when she had done that, she came home and she cried all night long in bed.
But that's exactly what coercive control does. Like how you said that, the abusers will transition. They're very aware of how other people are perceiving them and what
Yes,
consequences they might have. So if physical abuse is going to get them in trouble or no longer working, then they will shift to mind control. And it's coercive control. The easiest way I think to think about it is you're put in a psychological prison. You don't know that you were put in the prison. You don't know that how to get out of it. You don't know how it happened, but what you were saying to her was so powerful because you were essentially teaching her that she can leave that prison, that
Yes.
she can choose something different. And I think part of the reason that these relationships are also so confusing is because abusers are putting in so much effort to how they're perceived. So a lot of times, women will think they're so cruel to me, but so nice to everybody else. So obviously they're capable of being nice.
Oh,
They
yeah,
must just
absolutely.
be me. So you talked about how he's an intimidating bully who wants the community to accept him, but the fear that he generates at home needs to be matched by the acceptance he garners from those outside the home. So
Yes.
you're saying the fact that he treats other people differently is exactly what an abuser does.
Yes. Now, you may, part of what I learned about you was that you were into John Gottman in a way, and that he wrote a book, God, it must be in the early 90s, and I can't remember the guy, there were two of them wrote the book, but he divided these abusive men into cobras and pit bulls.
I do
And
remember that. Yeah.
so the common abuser was a pit bull who just grabbed onto everybody and tried to control the woman's life at every hand's turn, so she couldn't do anything. And he said there was a smaller percentage of guys he described as the cobras, who for most of the day or week or year, they didn't care what their partners were doing. But if the partner wasn't available to them when they wanted sex, then they would be very, very violent and lethal. And he did discover that these guys were slightly different in that they had a facility which, when they got angry, instead of becoming excited and their blood pressure going up or their heart rate going up or their temperature going up, they actually cooled down in every way and they became quite cold and calm. And that was another interesting fact that we discovered in our groups, and we could distinguish those two types of people readily once we knew what we were looking for.
Wow. I can see that. And I can see that in my story. And I imagine that people listening sometimes it's a palpable shift. Like when they get you to start reacting, it's almost like you're a puzzle piece that they just got to fall into place. And as soon as you
Yes,
fall into place, they just kind of sit back and they're like, wow, somebody's really upset. Somebody has an anger problem. And they just continue to push and they take no accountability whatsoever for what they just, created in
sure.
you, like how they triggered you. But if somebody is listening and they're still struggling to accept that this is intentional, this is like what,
Yes.
so much of what your work is talking about is how aware these abusers are of what they're doing. So how do we begin to accept this is not a mistake, this is not a misunderstanding. They know what they're doing and it's intentional.
Well, I think the first thing is, and maybe it's working backwards, is to discover what the intention is. And the intention is sexual dominance.
Mm,
And it is probably easier for a man to say that and to arrive at that conclusion. And there are lots of other people who would, especially women, who can't accept that at all, that that's not what guys think or how they act or whatever. But most men that I know are in intimate relationships mainly because there's a sexual pleasure in being in a relationship. They didn't get into the relationship so that somebody would make their meals or wash their socks or anything. They could get their mother to do that, no bother. So they got into a relationship to have a comfortable sexual relationship. And these men actually want a sexual relationship without resistance. So it's on demand, whatever way they want it, when they want it. And I was working on a team with two other men and three women, and the girls on the team couldn't really get their head around this idea at all, that that's how a man's mind works a lot of the time. But when they spoke to their clients and when we developed what we were thinking, it became fairly obvious when you'd listen to the men, when we allowed the men to talk to each other in the groups, that that's what they were about. And they got to the stage almost where they boasted about it, That's how they ran their lives, and that's why they did what they did. And that became the focus of our decisions then and our analysis, that if that was their intention, then all the other steps and tactics made sense. And one of the things that we were unsure about at the beginning, but I think we came to the conclusion eventually that most of the other tactics were actually smoke screens. That this is what they wanted people to talk about. This is what they wanted people to know, that they lost their temper, or that their partners were made the wrong meals, or wasn't able to look after the house or the children or whatever, and that she was inadequate in so many different ways. And nobody actually analysed what was going on in the bedroom. And the initial clients that I had, I think it was my reluctance to actually ask them about it. Would you invite me into the bedroom and describe what was happening? It took me about 15 years to get the courage to actually ask those questions. And my initial question always was, did you ever have sex when you didn't want it? And that revealed so much. The answer I got just expanded and expanded. It really played out what I thought was the reality, but I wasn't sure until the women told me that this was their experience.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about my own and so many other survivors that I work with. It's not something I think we talk about enough. There's so much shame around it. A lot of times, women will carry a lot of the shame because, again, if you don't know you're being abused, then you also might make decisions about your sexuality or things that you do within that relationship that don't really feel like you and that you carry shame about. But it really was because of like the fact that you were being controlled. So, do you think that, or have you ever studied the correlation between a male intimate abuser and having a sex addiction or a porn addiction? And what do you think about that?
I'm not sure if I agree with having a sex addiction or a porn addiction. I think that the few people that I've encountered who claim to have that, I think when steps were taken to separate them from the methods that they used to excite themselves, when that was all taken away, the addiction went away very quickly. I wouldn't accept it as an excuse from any guy. I think it's one of the demands of a man, really, if you want to be a man, that you need to be able to control your own sexuality. And I think that any good man will work diligently to do that because it takes an effort. But the guys who don't want to do it, I regard them as having lost their conscience in some way. They've no little voice at the back of their head which says, John, you can't do this. This is wrong. So they just get on with their lives and they use all sorts of labels to excuse themselves. That they're I'm not sure that they're not capable of being decent guys. So when I encounter one of these men now, that's the work I do with them. I'll say, you're sitting here in front of me, you're behaving very respectfully, you're treating me like you should, and I know that you're capable of going home and treating your wife the same way. I don't tell them that there's anything wrong with them. I'll tell them that it's a decision they've made not to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you see treatment as, or if you're treating a male intimate abuser, you see addressing basically their sexual entitlement as an essential part of that treatment.
The only thing. The rest of the stuff doesn't really matter. That's what the women told me, the target women. When we actually, as you say, when we got over the shame, both mine and theirs, and when we began to talk about it in a clear way, I suppose even without the emotion, it's very difficult to take the emotion out of the bedroom. But if you can do that and talk about it in a factual way, then you realize that what the guys are doing is very deliberate and very, very focused.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's like the sexual dominance and entitlement is the core, and everything else they do is just an offshoot to address that core.
Well, it's twofold. It is part of the invading of somebody's mind. So the things they do are colonizing her thinking, but they're also distracting everybody else from the bedroom. So everybody, like there are several groups of women in Ireland who work diligently for the last 40 or 50 years on this issue, but they concentrate still on physical violence and financial abuse and isolation, and they can talk for days on it, but it's not actually what the guys are about.
So if you don't address the sexual dominance and the sexual entitlement, then you're really not addressing enough of the problem. Like it's just going to
Not,
continue.
you're not addressing any of the problem.
Mm.
I had this long debate with Evan Stark. I don't know if you've heard of him. He worked with women who were going through the court process a lot, and he actually wrote the book on coercive control. And I said to him, "What do you know about the abusers?" And he said, "Don," he said, "I'll have to tell you, I know very little. My information has come from my clients who are the target women of these abusers." He also said that the revolution was stalled, and he did agree with me. Maybe that's why it stalled. Maybe talking to women about women's experience isn't working. What we need to do is to get really into a place where we can analyze what the guys are doing.
Do you think that there's any kind of treatment that will change a male abuser?
Take an easy answer to that. As I told you already, I was reared a Catholic, and there is an amazing verse in the New Testament of the Bible, which when Jesus was asked, "Well, what would you do with these guys?" What he said was, "You get a millstone, which is a big rock of granite, you tie it around their neck, and you drown them." Now, I mean, if he was one of the early philosophers and one of the early psychologists that I've read, if that was his attitude, and then he was saying, there is nothing you can do to stop these guys or to change these guys because they believe they're entitled to do what they do.
Yeah. Entitlement, I keep coming back to that, seems to be at the core of
Yes,
abusers, period. Like
yes,
any abuse, because you have to fundamentally believe that what you want takes precedence over the other person.
absolutely, absolutely. You're so right. Yeah, yeah,
And I do believe there's a point at which the conscience gets seared. And I think that's what you're talking about as well.
yes,
Like I know so many, that's why I wanted to read that quote that you said about there's that evil and malevolence that you feel, because that is also a common theme that I've seen and I've heard from clients that I've worked with. They see like the black eyes. We talk about it's like their eyes go dark. And it's
sure.
like you feel like there's no soul. Like you just feel like you are in the presence of evil, and it is scary and terrifying. And so I pass for so many. There's like a spiritual component or an evil or a malevolence that kind of follows these kind of people around.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating about them is they can turn it on, like you say, the eyes go dark when it suits them. That's what's really scary about
Yeah. And that's that, going back to like that is the intentionality.
it.
Because how can they be so charming and charismatic in the beginning to get you into the relationship to manage everybody's opinions of them? Like honestly, it's incredible. Nobody puts more effort and energy into managing their appearance than an abuser.
Certainly, most of them would have a huge public image concern. Yes.
Huge, yes. So I wanted our last few minutes just transition briefly to, I know the rest of your, half of your book is talking about how do you take those steps to freedom? How do you escape from this kind of coercive control? I know you talked about intuition. So talk to us a little bit more about how you see that as almost being like the protected part of you that is still there, even if you feel like you don't know who you are anymore, you've lost yourself. You say that intuitive part of you is still there. Talk to us
Oh,
about
it's
that.
still intact, completely intact. What a woman does is she hides it. She doesn't actually lose it. She just hides it deep within herself. So to get that voice speaking, the first thing I would say to my client is to actually stop talking about him, which every therapist in the world says, "Oh, Don, we'll all be out of business now, because she needs to come and talk about." I say, no, actually, talking about him keeps that alive in her mind, keeps it in her brain. And she says that if she can begin to talk about other things, if she can say to herself, "I will not mention his name for a week," then she's getting back the control of what one of my colleagues calls now the algorithm in her brain. I don't know what an algorithm is, but one of my is a high tech lady, and that if she can get out of that circle in her brain, that I call it a videotape, but begin to think outside of that, she will begin to realize that she has a voice within herself, which is very pleasant and can discuss the world and can talk to people about things other than him. Because most of the time, when she's with her friends or her family or her work colleagues, that's what she's talking about. And so if I can stop that cycle for a while, I think the other voice will begin to reemerge.
Yeah. Because you don't realize, you lose yourself in that relationship because for all the things that you've described, how they set it up, you begin to orient yourself around the abuser. What do they want? What do they feel? What do they need? So you feel like you've lost yourself, but really you've just lost touch with yourself.
That's all.
Your sense of self is still there. Like you said, it's still intact. You have to realize, though, that you do exist outside of this relationship. There is a sense of self that is
Yeah,
still there.
absolutely. Yeah. And the thing that I think is most manageable for women is not to talk about him.
Yeah.
And that gives them a sense of regaining some kind of control, and they can develop that.
And my last question is if there's anything you could tell somebody to do if they've been resonating with this and they're struggling, what is one thing they could do to begin restoring their resilience?
Well, outside of the conversation that they might change, I think it would be really, really useful for every woman who's a target to realize that it was all done deliberately to manage her. I have had clients, and it's been 4 and 5 years talking to them, and they still don't accept that what happened was deliberate.
And I think the biggest way that we begin to realize it's deliberate is learning to think like an abuser. And what I mean by that is to get in their mind because you will never understand them from yourself. And I think that's where we get stuck is, well,
That would
how could I ever treat somebody like that? How could I ever imagine doing that? And you're trying to take your mindset and understand them, but they don't think like you at all.
Actually, I would agree with you to the extent that you and I and people like us, I'm taking it that we're both reasonably empathetic people, that we are incapable of actually understanding them.
Yeah.
So you don't have to understand them, you just have to stop them.
Mm, I love it. Thank you so much for this interview. It has been amazing. Where can people find out about you, your work? I know you've got 3 books. I assume they're on Amazon. Anywhere else we should be looking?
I don't know of anywhere else. I mean, I don't know what's on in the States. I do know that there's a couple of colleagues in the lady with the algorithms in California. She happens to be a former IBM computer engineer, so she knows what she's talking about. And hopefully, we will develop a program with her and a few other ladies, probably starting in the new year. She seems to be anxious not to do anything until the midterm elections are over because she says that blows everything else off the scene. Everybody's caught up in it. And so she said we'll wait until after the elections and hopefully we will develop it. But 2 things I'd say to you, Chelsey, is A, if any of your clients would like to contact me, they can come through you. You can give them my email if you feel that it's okay to do that. And the second thing is if you wanted to have me back again with some of their questions or see where we go, how to develop this process, then I'd be more than delighted to do that.
Wonderful. I am sure we will have questions. Thank you so much for today. Thank you so much, Dawn, for helping us understand the mind of a male intimate abuser and giving us the tools to protect ourselves. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe to the show so you always get notified of new videos. And as always, I want to remind you that no matter where you are on your healing journey, resilience can be restored. And we're going to keep building it together. I'll see you in the next episode.